Tigran Petrosian, the great world champion, was known for squeezing the life out of his opponents. He would use space to his advantage, but particularly, he was able to take away their active possibilities before they even knew they had them. And in this game against Grandmaster Swetin, we see him playing an opening that is named after him, the Petrosian system against the King's Indian defense. So Tigran Petrosian has white and Alexei Swetin has black. Let's jump right in. C4, excuse me, knight f6, knight c3, g6, e4. This is a move order, by the way, is primarily a way to avoid the Grunfeld defense. d6, d4, bishop g7, bishop to e2, leaving the knight at g1 undeveloped. Again, that limits black's options. Castles, knight to f3 and e5. We have the main starting position of the King's Indian defense classical variation, and white usually castles here. And after knight to c6, plays d5, knight e7, and we get a very fast position where black is playing f5, attacking on the king side, white is playing c5, attacking on the queen side. But the Petrosian system plays the move d5 immediately. Now, this is a restraining idea. Basically, the concept is he wants to play the bishop to g5 and make it harder for black to execute his plan, and it slows the play down quite a bit. There is one downside. By committing to the center so quickly, he allows white's knight to come to c5, which is a good square for the knight, but Petrosian never seemed to be too worried about that. Knight b to d7, aiming at that square. He wants to play knight c5 and a5, so white can't kick the knight away with b4. Castles, knight to c5, hitting the e4 pawn, so queen to c2 keeps that pawn defended. And now a5. Now the knight is comfortably on c5, and if white wants to eject that knight, it's going to be a slow process to do it. So basically what black wants to do is move the knight away, play f5, and begin his kingside attack. So the next key move of the Petrosian system is bishop to g5, pinning that knight so it can't quite move. And believe it or not, it's somewhat frustrating for black to untangle from this pin. It is not so easy to deal with. It requires quite a few moves to deal with it. First, h6. This is really a necessary move, but it is weakening. It does weaken the kingside squares, and at some point he might be able to put some pressure on this square. He brings the bishop back to e3. Now knight f to d7. Knight to g4 looks more natural, clearing the way for the f-pawn and also attacking the dark squared bishop. But then you get a variation like this, where the bishop actually gives itself up for the knight, and then you kick the knight, knight f6, and then knight e5, and you exchange a few pieces. f4, bishop d4, king h2 check, and this structure, white is better with this large central pawn mass. It's not, black isn't lost, but white is definitely better here. So here black plays the knight back in preparation for f5. The knight comes to d2 so that when f5 is played, he can advance the f-pawn. f5 is played, and the main move here, the standard move in this type of Mar del Plata King's Indian structure, is f3. And then after f4, bishop f2, g5, you get a standard attack where black is playing for the g4 push. But in this case, Petrosian has a different plan in mind. He takes on f5. Then when the pawn recaptures, he plays f4. He doesn't want black to have that space on the king side, and he's counterattacking in the center, taking black away from his normal King's Indian plans. And if black plays e4 here, then after knight to b3, white is doing well. He's challenging the knight on c5. He could also come into d4 and pop into the e6 square if need be. So Alexei Swetin takes on f4, bishop takes f4, and now all Petrosian needs to do is move his a rook to e1 to be completely developed. Swetin plays knight to e5, rook a to e1, and bishop to d7. So all the minor pieces are developed, and we can get a sense of this position. Now, black's pieces are active, and they're on good squares, but he also has a lot of weaknesses. The f5 pawn is weak, the h6 pawn is weak, the e6 square and g6 squares are weak. So black has piece activity, but he also has quite a few weaknesses. The first thing Petrosian does, it's a very Petrosian-like idea. The best piece for black is this knight at e5, so he plays his knight to f3, immediately challenging that knight to get it off of the board. Queen to f6, queen to d2, put some pressure on g6, rook a to e8, and now knight takes e5, getting rid of black's best placed piece. e5, bishop to e3, which threatens the knight on c5, but he plays b6. It's kind of a tricky thing to take that knight. You'd lose that important dark squared bishop, but you would also further wreck black's pawn structure. You'll notice here these pawns on e5 and f5, these are similar to the hanging pawns that you get in queen pawn openings. Basically, white wants one of these pawns to advance, to fix them as a weakness, and then attack the weak squares left behind. Bishop to h5 hits the rook at e8, rook goes to e7. Now the bishop comes back to d1. The idea is the bishop wants to go to c2, attack this f5 pawn in an attempt to get it to advance and control the light squares. Queen to d6, bishop to c2, continuing the pattern. Now, rook e to f7 was played. If he plays f4, then you can take on c5. After queen c5 check, king h1, the light squares in black's position are just too weak. The knight can go there. The queen can even go to d3, setting up these kind of batteries at some point. It would leave too many weaknesses. And if e4, then bishop f4, bishop e5, then knight to e2. The knight can come in and threaten the e6 square, and it's a good situation for Petrosian. So rook e to f7. He wants to over-defend this pawn so he can keep both of these pawns in place. King to h1. Rook to a8. Now, the idea behind this move is that if white plays a3, he wants to be able to play a4 and support this so this pawn can't advance to b4 and kick the knight out. That's the idea behind rook to a8. Rook to e2. Petrosian's going to play the rook to f2 and put more pressure on the f5 pawn. Queen to f8, rook e to f2, and now knight to b7. Black sees the knight is eventually going to be kicked from c5, so he reroutes it to the d6 square. Queen to e2, threatening queen to h5, again to add further pressure to that pawn. He'd have the bishop, both rooks, and the queen attacking f5. The knight goes to d6, and now he plays the move c5, breaking up black's queenside pawns. Computers actually show us an interesting, a crazy move, actually. Knight to e4. I wanted to show you this because it looks just impossible, but if pawn takes knight, rook f7, knight f7, bishop c1, modern computers show us that white is completely winning this position, even though he's a whole piece down. Threat of queen to e4, the pin on the f-file, and black would actually be lost in that situation. I wanted to show you that variation. But c5, pawn takes, bishop takes c5. Now we look at black's pawn structure. It's a mess. Every pawn is essentially weak, but he still does have active pieces, and this is typical King's Indian stuff. And Petrosian's going to have to deal with that piece activity. If he can deal with it, he's going to win. Rook to b8 attacks the b pawn. The pawn moves to b3. Now here, queen to c8 was played, and this may be a mistake. You know, moving the queen away from the king side might be a little risky here. E4 was Petrosian's recommendation for black, but after queen to e3, bishop f6, knight to e2, again with the idea of coming to f4, queen g7, knight f4, Petrosian would still have been better in this position. So queen to c8 was played, queen to h5, continuing the pattern of the queen that we talked about earlier to pressure f5, and now queen to a6. Now this is actually a trap. He's playing a trap on Petrosian. Very unlikely to work, but it could work against most players. Here is the trap. If Petrosian takes on d6, pawn takes d6, and then bishop takes f5, it does look like the f5 pawn is hanging, but it is not hanging, because after bishop f5, rook takes f5, Alexei Swetin would have played this shocking move, queen takes f1 check, which would force rook takes queen, rook takes f1 mate. So that's the idea behind queen to a6. Petrosian, seeing that, decides to play g4 and really put pressure on those light squares, even if it means his king becomes a little bit vulnerable. If black plays e4, then just taking on f5, even after bishop takes knight, after f6, black is completely busted. Queen takes h6, rook to g1 check, and black would be completely lost there. So he plays f4 instead, but that does weaken these light squares. The modern computer's choice here is rook to g1, with the idea of playing g5. Black has no chance of surviving. Petrosian plays rook to e1, keeping his focus, again, I think, on these light squares, is sort of where he's thinking. Queen to c8, and now bishop takes d6. Now, Petrosian was proud of this move, but this is a move that modern computers show us was not best. Rook to g1 is still the best idea here. But after bishop takes d6, pawn takes, bishop g6, hits the rook at f7, the rook goes to f8, and now knight to e4. And I will say, Petrosian's pieces really look beautiful. They're all very comfortably placed, and he looks like he's doing very well here. But bishop g4 would have worked for black, even though white is still attacking after queen to h4. Black can play on in this position and be okay. But instead, he plays the move f3. Now g5, advancing the pawn. Rook to f4. And here, a gh6 was strong, but Petrosian plays rook to g1, building up against the king at g8. Bishop g4 is still black's best. He plays bishop to f5. Obviously, he wants to trade off this nasty light-squared bishop. Petrosian doesn't do that. He plays gh6, opening up the play against the king, and black is in big trouble. He takes the knight, and after bishop takes e4, black resigned in this position. There's nothing he can do to save the bishop, and if he just goes ahead and takes on e4, hg7, and that's it. The queen is coming to h8, and the game is decided. A great game from Petrosian, who always knew what his opponent was going to do, even before his opponent knew what they were going to do. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.